Hello everybody and welcome. Jess here, and today we're in Jaffrey, New Hampshire, where we're doing a little bit of sightseeing. Right now I am in the Conant Cemetery. The other day my husband asked me, have you ever heard of the Dean murder? So that just sent me into a reading spiral, which I tend to get into. It is definitely one of those stories that I had to read a couple of times to really allow it to sink in, because it sounds like something out of a movie and it's almost unbelievable. And because I want to respect the privacy of the current homeowners, I'm not gonna go filming at their doorsteps. But I will show you some pictures that I found that will give you an idea of what the house looks like now versus what the house looks like back when the murder took place. Now, for those of you who are not familiar, Jaffrey is really at the base of our beautiful Mount Monadnock. It is one of the most climbed mountains in the world. You actually get a perfect view of it from where I am right now. It's pretty beautiful with the snow cap on it. So while true crime is not necessarily my jam here on this channel, I thought it was a really unique story with a pretty crazy overall twist that I think you guys are really gonna enjoy sticking around for. Imagine a time when automobiles weren't common. There were a few in town and most of them were put up in the winter. You got around by horse and buggy or horseback, or you walked. Speaking of automobiles, because there were so few, automobile shops, car shops, garages, they weren't a thing. So instead you saw livery stables that would shod your horses and repair your buggies and your wagons and your sleds. That was the norm. There were no cell phones, and there were only a couple of landlines called party lines within the town. Silent movies were a thing, and they were viewed in the Coolidge Hall here in town. Woodrow Wilson was president, elected in 1912. In August of 1914, the war in Europe broke out and everybody was on edge. They wanted to stay out of it. But as much as America tried to remain neutral, Germany pretty much forced the president's hand. February of 1917, the Germans started submarine warfare against everybody. No one was off limits. All merchant shipping was targeted, leaving President Woodrow Wilson with no choice. In April of that same year is when President asked Congress to declare war on Germany. And why is any of this relevant? It's important for you to understand how on edge everybody was. During this time, people saw lights in the mountains and thought they were signals. And even at one point, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, which was the precursor to the FBI as we know it today, came out to investigate, thinking that maybe there was German sympathizers or spies amongst us. Over 120 Jaffrey boys enlisted in the World War I efforts. Jaffrey as a town itself became heavily involved as well. They started making hobnails for soldiers' shoes, denim for uniforms, and wooden cases for shipping boxes. People were incredibly suspicious and anti-German, if we're being honest. It seemed like all everybody was talking about were the signal lights on the mountain. So let's start with one certain party in relation to this case, the Colfelts. So this is a name you will be hearing again, so commit it to memory. This distinguishable character had previously rented a spot in town. They hailed from New York and were basically a trust fund family. People had their suspicions about them. They had no ties or family or even friends to bring them to the area. Most people, when they come to Jaffrey, they come for the summer. But the Colfelts came year-round, and that made people suspicious considering everyone was wondering, are there German spies amongst us? Colfelt rented out the main house, the large house on William Dean's property. And it was at this time that Mary and William moved into the smaller bungalow on their parcel of land. This gave them a steady, if not small, income to live off of. And just before the murder, the Colfelts abruptly left town. There's rumors that there was a falling out with William Dean and the Colfelts. Regardless of what happened, at the time, they had moved to Temple. The most likely suspect, though, was a banker, a judge, an insurance agent. Basically, he had his hands everywhere. He was a very well-known politician who knew William since 1886 when William had purchased the property. They were close friends who often played golf and billiards together. All right, so it actually didn't take long. It was the first spot that I thought to look after seeing a reference photo. Oh, and look, we've had some deer out here. But here we go. This is the headstone for the Rich family. It's a little difficult to see. We've got some growth there. But Charles Rich passed away in 1933. But who was our victim? Well, that would be one William K. Dean. His father was one of the first missionaries to China. And as a child, William was a playmate of the Prince of Siam. So quoting Charles Rich in his testimony, he had a natural bent for religion, but he didn't go to church. He, as a young man, moved back to New York, where he studied with his uncle and was going to school for medicine. He did really well, but he fell in love with his cousin, which is still weird to me. I know that was a thing back then, but he ended up marrying her, Mary, and the two of them decided to move to Jaffrey, New Hampshire. Now, back in this time, 1918, the thing to do was be a gentleman or a gentlewoman farmer, which William took to heart. He had one cow that he milked at kind of odd hours, people noted, because he liked to sleep in. He didn't want to wake up at the crack of dawn. So he was known to go out late at night to milk his cow. Everybody was welcome in his home, unless you talked business or politics. He was known as a friendly, cordial fellow. Also, I've seen things written that he was a bit of a ladies' man, not in the way that we would think of a ladies' man nowadays, but he was friendly with everybody. He was well-read. He loved to read. On a hot Tuesday afternoon of August the 12th, 1918, Dr. Dean was seen making an appearance in town. There's mention of him seeing Charles Rich's sister, who was visiting, and supposedly he went back to the Rich's house and visited with them for a bit. However, this cannot be confirmed because the person that you would think to confirm it with, Mrs. Dean, was actually soft in the mind, as they called it back then, which nowadays we would probably have referred to it more of a case of dementia. Charles Rich describes her as being childlike in the last couple of years leading up to the murder. So his visit to the Rich's house has never really been confirmed from what I could see. There have been reports that I've seen that also state that Charles Rich actually came to William's house to be treated for a very severe looking black eye, which he states his horse kicked him and knocked something into him, which the timing of all of this seems a little bit convenient. Earlier in the day though, it has been mentioned and reported by the New England Historical Society that he asked a neighbor who was leaving for Boston that morning if she would get in touch with the authorities. Apparently he had some information, but he didn't share what it was. It was just important to get to the police. Which, as you can imagine, is, I'm sure, where all of these theories and suspicions kind of stemmed from. This case is wild. So after it's all said and done, William Dean goes back home. He has a meal, which forensics tells us is true. And after that, he went out late to milk his cow. When he didn't come in, Mrs. Dean was a little worried, but let it go until the following morning when she phoned authorities and said that Billy was in deep water, which, as you will find out, is a bit of an ironic twist to this tragic story. People came and searched without much luck. A few hours later though, somebody checked out the cistern and happened to find the body of William Dean. When I first read this, I was thinking, how on earth did you not think to check in the cistern? But I was thinking perhaps a big tank like we saw at Billings Farm. It wasn't though. It was more of a dugout well type cistern, as you can see from the photos. William Dean had been the victim of a brutal, cold-blooded murder. His hands were tied behind his back, his legs were tied, he'd been beaten and strangled, and what's more, to absorb some of the blood, a blanket was laid on his head where a burlap bag was placed with a heavy stone which was reported to be about 25 pounds. And then he was dumped in the cistern. They didn't find a ton of clues. There was reportedly some blood that had fallen on the porch to his barn, and the boards were taken out to preserve that. There was some scratches and blood stains throughout, but they couldn't find much. And it did not help that the day after all of this went down, there was a huge, supposedly the biggest thunderstorm of the year, which washed away any footprints that they might have found. William had been attacked and murdered in the barn. There was no evidence of anything being dragged, and thus it was determined that after being murdered, William was carried and dropped in the cistern. As you can imagine, people were stunned. This was a violent crime, and it's a fairly small town. It left people even more suspicious. They were already on edge with everything going on with Germany. Who could possibly commit such a tragic crime against such a likable, well-known neighbor? Some suspected his wife, but she was in no state to be carrying, let alone committing this very physical crime. Then again, she had made reference to Billy being underwater. But at 68, with a failing mind and weakening body, it is highly unlikely that she could have committed this violent act against her husband, even if it was in a fit of rage. Plus, there's motive. Mary didn't have any reason to be angry or at odds with her husband. There's been mention that possibly it was jealousy, but even that doesn't make much sense. There are a number of theories concerning this case. Remember William Dean's very good friend, Charles Rich? Well, first off, we need to address the very convenient timing of his black eye. And it was actually because of this that led the police to believe that Charles Rich was the prime suspect in this case. This prominent local figure becomes the prime suspect for obvious reasons. He insists that it was his horse and that it was an accident. Yet, it left most people understandably suspicious. And of course, having only his wife and his sister and the deceased Dr. Dean to vouch for his story, people had a hard time believing it. What's more, and what really gets me though, is that a friend of Charles Rich went to the scene of the crime on the day of and cleaned up the barn area. Seems pretty convenient. Destroying evidence, perhaps? It's certainly odd. I know that times were different back then, but who thinks to do that? It is a crime scene. Another theory is going to bring us back to the morning of William Dean's murder. Remember, he had some information for the police? Some people think that perhaps he had some incriminating information against his friend William, or even perhaps the Colfelds. Remember them? Lawrence Colfeld wasn't around and was far away when the murder took place, but some people think that maybe he hired someone to take him out. Another theory is that maybe some hoodlums just got caught in his barn, and in their terror at being found out, they accidentally killed him. Once it had happened, they tried to hide the evidence. The case on William Dean really seemed to stall out. It was around this time that William's brother shows up with a criminal psychologist whose practices would make most people scoff. Apparently, him and his wife were actually run out of England for some of their fortune-telling schemes. This man's name was Wilhelm de Curler. And if I pronounced that incorrectly, you let me know, because I'm terrible with names. Really though, he was just a con man and a showman. He did end up having the authorities exhume William's body, and there are some pretty graphic photos that are available for public view if you're into that sort of thing. I'm not gonna drop that one on the screen. Nothing came from adding him to the investigation, and William's brother decided to dismiss him. But when he did, the town picked him up and allowed him to continue on the investigation at a pretty high cost, apparently. But still nothing came of it. Mary Dean died shortly after the murder. The psychic investigator, our con man, died in a Mexican bar fight in 1928. And as for Charles Rich, the local politician and banker, he remained in town under much scrutiny and suspicion until his death in 1933. I need to shout out to Margaret Bean, because a lot of the information I found was actually dug up by her. Apparently, she spent about 6 years going through the court transcripts and translating out of Pitman Short the shorthand that was used in the note-taking of the grand jury inquest. She also has a book that I am absolutely gonna pick up and read because I am fascinated by this. And here we are, over 100 years later, and the case is still unsolved. So who do you think did it? Maybe we'll never know. It's interesting too because whoever did commit the crime is clearly already past at this point, and they won't get the justice that is deserved, which is sad. Be sure to like if you enjoyed this video, and do me a favor and hit that subscribe button, because after all, it helps me out, and I really love seeing that you guys enjoy the videos that I'm putting out. Plus, it's gonna keep you up to date on everything we've got going on. It's certainly tough in this area to find things that are open right now. Most things open Memorial Day and are open through summer because of our cold and winter and ice and snow. Because of that, I'm a little bit limited locally, but we will be in Florida in about a week. So pretty soon we'll have some more sunny vlogging for your entertainment. I think that's probably gonna do it for us today. Thanks so much for sticking around, and we'll see you next time on Travel Pixie Style.